Welcome to episode 26. In today's episode, we are going to talk all about the hamstrings. And as yogis, we know that the hamstrings are both anatomically a very centrally located body part or muscle group for us, but also a special and near and dear body part to our hearts because it is the muscle that we stretch to get into forward folds. And not only is it a muscle that requires a lot of flexibility, but for yogis, it also tends to be a muscle that is very weak and sometimes even painful. So, in this episode, we are going to start off by talking about the anatomy of the hamstrings just briefly. And then we'll talk about how to both stretch and strengthen the hamstrings. Topics that we'll cover in addition to the anatomy and stretching and strengthening are proximal hamstring tendinopathy, or known also as yoga butt, as well as whether we should bend our knees in forward folds to quote unquote protect the hamstrings. Also, what's up with cramps and why do the hamstrings cramp? And if we have time, then we will get into some questions that we got from our loyal listeners. We are also, as a tie into today's episode, we have to tell you about a brand new program that we are releasing, which is called 5 Weeks to Strong and Flexible Hamstrings. This program is lead practices by Jenni and me. So all you have to do is press play and go. They are a series of short 20 to 25 minute practices that you will receive over a 5-week period. And they're designed specifically for yogis to stretch and strengthen the hamstrings. And we're not releasing this program until October 10th for the general public. But if you are listening to this episode before October 10th, then as a special thank you for being a loyal podcast listener, you can get the program before the general public at an extra special discounted price at strengthforyoga.com/5-weeks. And that link will be in the show notes. If you're listening the week of October 10th, it will still be on sale at a slightly higher but still discounted price. And then after the 16th of October, it'll go up to the regular price. So get it now. Again, the link is strengthforyoga.com/5-weeks. That link is in the show notes. So let's get started with our episode. Jenni, thank you for joining today.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. I would like to have you start off by telling us a little bit about the anatomy of the hamstrings. So what are the hamstrings? Which muscles make it up? And what do they do?
Well, those are excellent questions. It's kind of like foundational knowledge that we want to have under our belt in order to start to kind of dive into this topic. So the hamstrings, I think they're kind of like in a layperson's understanding. And I just know that I used to think this too before I learned about anatomy. I just kind of thought of them as just like one big muscle. Like
Sure.
I didn't even know why it was hamstrings, like multiple. It's just like that's a hamstring and another hamstring on each leg.
Yeah, well, it's not like the quadriceps, right? Like quad means 4. So you know, well, maybe you know right off the bat that means it's a group of 4 muscles. But the hamstrings,
that's right.
It's not like the triceps. Well, yeah, it's not. It doesn't tell you how many there are.
It doesn't have like a number built into the name. Exactly. And I should quickly just take a step back and lay out, just in case anyone didn't know, that the hamstrings are basically the muscles along the back of your thigh or the back of your femur. So and obviously, as you said in the intro, they're the muscles we stretch when we fold forward. And we all kind of know that sensation of feeling that stretch through the backs of the legs. So yeah, and despite potentially popular thought, the hamstrings are not just one big muscle on the back of each thigh, but they're actually a collection of 3 muscles on the back of each thigh. And we'll state the names of them. And if you're especially anatomy geeky, then maybe you want to learn and memorize them. But I'm not sure that it's like super important, especially on like a practical day-to-day level. But we've got...
Yeah, I don't know.
You think maybe?
No, I wrestle with that too.
Like how important it is to memorize these muscle names.
Yeah. There must be a reason why they why they teach it to us in our anatomy textbooks and, well, really anatomy
Yeah.
in general. But maybe that's a conversation for
like a different episode.
A larger occasion, yeah.
Right. I should qualify this by saying I do really appreciate knowing the names of muscles. And I feel like I use that a lot in my work and the way I think about the body, but just not necessarily needing to, state that everybody needs to have these names in their heads necessarily.
Yeah, you can always ask Google.
Yeah, 100%. We always have that tool at our fingertips. But we've got, so the three muscles that make up your hamstrings are, there's the semi-membranosus and the semi-tendinosus. And when I learned about the hamstrings, I learned about those two as often referred to as the semi-sisters. Just kind of helps remember that, the semi-sisters. And those two hamstring muscles are medial on the leg. So that means like toward the midline, like as opposed to lateral toward the outside. And semi-membranosus is deep to semi-tendinosus. So those are those two. And then we have our third hamstring muscle, which is lateral. So toward the, outside. And that's your biceps femoris. And that muscle technically has two heads. So I should take a step back and say that all of the hamstring muscles, they attach up on our sitting bones, or the ischial tuberosities, to be extra anatomy geeky. That's the technical name. But they attach their proximal attachment is on the sitting bone, and then they run down along the back of the thigh. They cross the back of the knee, and they attach to our lower leg. And so biceps femoris, I mentioned, it has two heads. One of its heads, the long head, attaches up there at the sitting bone along with the semi-sisters. But then the short head of the biceps femoris starts like partway down the femur or the thigh bone, and then it goes down.
So they don't all actually cross the hip, because the short.
That's right.
The three of them, semi-membranosus, semi-tendinosus, and the long head of the biceps femoris or femoris, cross the hip and the knee, but the short head only crosses the knee.
Precisely. Exactly. So that's kind of, did I miss anything, Travis, in just describing the basic anatomy of the hamstrings?
No, I think the only tricky thing sometimes is that because our anatomy is like continuous, that it can sometimes be hard to differentiate the medial adductors from the medial hamstrings. And so I don't know if that now's a good time to talk about this or later. But the adductor magnus is another muscle that extends the hip like the hamstrings do. So it can be tricky. But let's say what the actions are, and then we can come back to that. It'll make more sense, right?
Yeah, so the adduct. Yeah.
Yeah. So based on where the hamstrings originate and insert, or the muscle attachments, what muscle actions do they do? And well, actually, this is a cool thing. So when I was in personal trainer school, I was like, why do we need to learn all these origins and insertions? This is boring. But my mentor said, if you know where the muscle originates and inserts, then you can always tell what action it does, because it brings those 2 points closer together, because muscles shorten when they contract. So if you know that the muscle is on the posterior side and crosses the hip and the knee, then as it contracts, that automatically tells you what the muscle does.
I really, really like that teaching tool. That is awesome. And just to layer on an extra thought, muscles, when they contract, they can shorten, but they can also contract and lengthen.
Sure.
While they're attempting to shorten, right? Just to be really clear, so that, because sometimes I think people think that contraction always means shortening.
Right. I mean, concentrically contract.
Yeah. Yeah. Muscles are always like attempting to shorten when they contract, but they're not always actually shortening.
Right. If the load on the muscle, if the external load exceeds the internal torque production, then it is lengthening while it's trying to contract.
That's right. Well, it's still trying to pull those two attachment points toward each other.
Yeah. From a concentric contraction standpoint, what are the hamstrings' two joint actions?
Totally. So the hamstrings are what's known as a biarticular muscles, meaning they cross two joints, except for the short head of the biceps femoris. So they're going to act on two joints, the two joints that they cross, which is the hip and the knee. So if we think about like those attachment points, as you said, and kind of moving toward one another, then, and I'm just kind of closing my eyes and thinking about it right now to imagine that. But if I think about the hamstring attachments on the lower leg crossing the back of the knee, if they were to contract and shorten, they would bend the knee. They would like lift if my foot was like not fixed to the floor, they would lift my heel up toward the back of my hip and bend the knee.
So if you were just standing and going into
yes.
like a tree pose, then to pick that foot up, that would be knee flexion, and the hamstrings would be performing that.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, bending the knee anatomically is called knee flexion. So yeah, when the hamstrings contract and shorten, they will flex the knee. They bend the knee, and that's what they do at the knee joint. And then the other joint that they cross, which is the hip, and they cross the back of the hip joint, they would well, I guess we could just picture standing once again. Say you're standing, and we're talking about the hamstrings on, say, the right leg. So my left foot is staying fixed on the floor, but my right foot, let's say, it's floating. And if the hamstrings were going to contract and shorten on the right leg, they would basically pull my right thigh back in space. And that direction of like pulling your thigh back in space is called hip extension.
So like if you were standing in Tadasana, mountain pose, and then you stepped back into Warrior One, the back leg would be going into hip extension, and one of the muscles involved would be the hamstrings.
Yeah, to like pull, to lift that leg back for sure. Or if you were lying, I think sometimes this is a helpful way to think of it. If you were lying face down or prone,
that's probably the easiest way to see it.
maybe because of the way gravity is working on.
Yeah.
If you're lying face down on the floor and you lift one leg or both legs really straight up off the floor, then that would be hip extension. That's like lifting your thigh up off the floor.
We know that pose to be
Shalabhasana.
Or at least half Shalabhasana, right?
Precisely. I love how you know. Yes. Or locust pose,
right?
Which is like a yoga back bend where we lift, if it's full Shalabhasana, then we lift our chest and maybe our arms up off the floor as well as the legs. But if we're only lifting the legs, then we might call that half Shalabhasana.
Yeah. And so that position is hip extension. I sometimes call it hip hyperextension because that's how I learned it. But I think you don't call it that.
You and I have talked about that before. Yeah.
But just from the standpoint of being in 0 degrees of hip extension, if you're just lying face down or standing, and then when the hip goes into more extension, you just call it hip extension, but I tend to call it hip hyperextension because that's how I've learned it.
Yeah.
And that we usually have like, I don't know, 10 to 20 degrees of hip hyperextension where the leg is lifting up higher than that neutral position.
Precisely. Yeah, I think sometimes people think that we have more hip extension available to us than we actually do. But I'm glad you pointed that out. Like 10 to 20 degrees isn't really very much.
Yeah. So if you're lifting your legs higher than that in Shalabhasana, it's not coming from pure hip extension or hyperextension. You're getting some lumbar extension as well. Yeah.
Right. Like a back bend in the spine is probably adding in. If the legs are higher, then really it's like an inch, a few inches. It's like not very high.
Yeah.
Yeah. For pure hip extension.
Yeah. Can we talk about, so we said that the hamstrings flex the knee and extend the hip. Can we talk about some of the other muscles, or maybe not all, the other muscles that do those joint actions that assist in those, just to paint a fuller picture of knee flexion and hip extension?
Right. Well, you mentioned a moment ago the adductor magnus, which I think is an often overlooked muscle when it comes to hip extension, because there are 5 total adductors, and the rest of them, the other 4, they do the opposite. They do hip flexion, but adductor magnus happens to attach on the sitting bone and it crosses the back of the hip, so it actually contributes and helps with hip extension. And we tend not to hear it discussed very often when we're talking about hip extension. You tend to hear more the hamstrings and the glutes. And the glutes, as we talked about in our episode on the glutes, we kind of detailed that quite a bit, what the glutes do. But like gluteus maximus and the back, the posterior fibers of gluteus medius and maybe minimus, they all also contribute to hip extension.
And more so with the knee flexed, right?
For the glutes. Yeah, good
because
point.
That puts the hamstrings in a position of active insufficiency.
That's right. That's right.
So because the hamstrings are a biarticular muscle, when you bend the knee, that puts the hamstrings in a disadvantageous position to extend the hip because of the length tension relationship. because they've already been shortened at the knee. So then when you go to do hip extension, you're going to bias the glutes.
The glutes. That's right.
Which is fine. It's important to know that having the knee straighter or more bent is going to shift the emphasis for that hip extension in one direction or the other. And we can use that to our advantage, whether we want to work the glutes more or the hamstrings more in something like a bridge, let's say.
Precisely. And that's why, like, if our focus really is to strengthen the hamstrings, which it very well might be, especially if we're talking about yogis, and how like they may have quite weak hamstrings, as we'll get into, then when they're doing strengthening exercises, it might really matter how they position their hip and their knee angle, to actually get like to really bias those hamstrings.
So
otherwise it could just be glutes.
Yeah, it's an opportunity. It's maybe an opportunity in a yoga class to say, well, and we're going to talk about this, but we're not getting a lot of hamstring strengthening. Are there ways where we can just subtly change the poses? Like maybe it is a bridge pose. Well, if we put our knees in more extension, create a longer bridge, then we can get more hamstring work there.
Precisely.
But that's not like the classic expression or the shape of that pose.
Right, because usually bridge pose is done with like the hip and the heel in just a vertical. The shin is like a vertical, which would bias the glutes more.
Can we do one more? What's the helper muscle for knee flexion? Just to finish painting that picture. So in addition to the hamstrings, which other muscles or really just muscle flexes the knee?
Sartorius?
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. I was thinking gastrocnemius.
Right, of the calves. Yeah, totally. So I was still sticking up on the thigh. Yeah. Right, 100%. Yeah, so the gastroc is your big superficial calf muscle, that like kind of two-sided muscle,
which is another biarticular muscle because its primary role is plantar flexion or pointing the toes, but it also flexes the knee. It assists in knee flexion. I love that you came up with the sartorius first.
Well, I was like, what other one is he talking about?
The sartorius muscle is also called, or the way to remember it, that's called the talar muscle, right? The talar's muscle, because it puts you into that talar's seated position,
like which a cross-legged
is just like your
seat.
Cross leg. Yeah. So it flexes the hip, flexes the knee, and externally rotates.
And I think abducts the hip as well.
That sounds right.
Yeah, so it does all that stuff.
It's like it's a very thin muscle that runs, I don't know.
Oh, like kind of obliquely across the thigh. Yeah, and I don't think it's not like I don't believe like a major mover muscle, compared to some of the
It's not like, people talk about, we're going to do leg day, or we're going to focus on hamstrings, or we're going to make a 5-week program dedicated to hamstrings, but nobody talks about we're training our sartorius today. Right,
Travis. I don't think anyone would buy our program.
Strong and flexible sartori. What's
sartorii?
What's
I don't even know that
sartorius is? That sounds like a dinosaur.
Oh my gosh, we'll have to look that up.
Yep.
All right. Well, yeah. Anyway, so yes, so
we could talk about how to strengthen the muscles then, right?
Yeah, precisely. So we know where they're located, we know where they attach, we know what they do, when they attempt to shorten, when they contract, hip extension, knee flexion. Yeah. So like on a basic level, like what does that look like if we want to think about strengthening the hamstrings? And sometimes for me, when I'm thinking about like strength exercises, it helps me to just think about classic exercises in the gym, because I feel like those are well positioned to just kind of understand how the
especially
joint action is working.
Especially
machines, exactly. Which is why I was going to suggest if we're thinking about the hamstrings and the knees, it helps me to think about this machine at the gym that's called a leg curl machine. And I believe there are like 2 variations. There's one where you can lie face down, and then there's one where you can
prone leg
sit.
curl, and then seated leg curl.
Right. And so in both cases, you basically position yourself in the machine, and then you've got this like pad hooked underneath the back of your ankles, and then you bend your knees trying to move that pad, but the pad is like attached to weights. It's like weighted down. So that's your resistance. And you're bending your knees. In fact, that's something I meant to say when explaining how to strengthen the hamstrings. It's that we need to bend the knee and or extend the hip, but we need to do those things against resistance.
Right.
And I think that's kind of key, because it's often easy to just assume like, oh, I see the knee bending, so it must be hamstring strengthening, you know? That's why I like to picture that leg curl machine in the gym, because I feel like that's kind of a clear way to understand, like, right?
So you're pulling your heel in towards your butt. And
Against
your heel is being resisted by that pad.
So if the leg curl machine is a good way to picture like a gym exercise and the knee flexion aspect, what do you think would be a good way to picture like some stereotypical gym exercise and strengthening the hamstrings across the hip? Would you say, Travis, that something like a certain types of deadlifts at the gym would also be good for strengthening the hamstrings through hip extension?
Yeah. And
like another good way to think about that?
Yeah. So a deadlift is just an exercise where you're picking a dead weight up off the ground. And the way that you do that looks pretty similar to a halfway lift in the bottom position. So knees are slightly bent. Well, this is the Romanian deadlift is the most like the halfway lift. Your knees are slightly bent, your hips are pushed back. So you feel a good stretch in that bottom position in your hamstrings. And then you grab the weight or grab onto the weight and then stand up into mountain pose. And then you reverse it to lower. So that's probably the quintessential posterior chain exercise from a gym context.
Right. But yeah, so if those are just some good ways that we can kind of picture like how we might actually apply load to the hamstrings in an effective way to build strength in a gym context, I think that just helps us for like educational purposes, thinking about how we might target that area for strength. So if we kind of more broadly apply those ideas to something like a yoga practice, maybe we could just take a look at our like a traditional yoga asana practice and investigate whether it actually strengthens the hamstrings. Like, what do you think?
So let's think about whether we have any poses in our yoga lexicon that strengthen knee flexion and hip extension,
because those are the two things you need,
especially through a full range of motion with a sufficient amount of load.
Precisely.
So, what's your list? Rattle them off.
Well, I can rattle off a couple you might think, but then you're like, oh, and we already talked about like how bridge pose as it's typically done in yoga, you know, you might think, well, I'm lifting my hips, there's hip extension.
Yeah.
But because the knees are so bent, as we just talked about, like to really target the hamstrings there, you'd want straighter knees, you know, like not so much. But so traditional bridge doesn't really count. And also we talked about how Shalabhasana also doesn't really count because it's it does do hip extension with straight knees. It does, but it's such a small range of motion and there's no added load beyond your legs. So it's just very limited, right?
Yeah. So it's not nothing, but
Shalabhasana is not nothing.
Who's been doing those poses for a while, you quickly run out of stimulus to effectively bring the hamstring strength up beyond whatever you've gotten from that initial stimulus.
We also already have talked about that connection or overlap between yoga's halfway lift and like a Romanian deadlift, you know, and how Romanian deadlift, you're lifting a weight and that's going to be good for strengthening the hamstrings. Why in a yoga context would a halfway lift maybe, well, I shouldn't assume it isn't. I'll ask you, is the yoga's halfway lift hamstring strengthening?
Only insofar as the weight of your torso, right?
Right.
So that's just, you're going to acclimate to that pretty fast.
Totally. And
you could do 100 halfway lifts and I don't know that your hamstrings, well, I don't know. Would your hamstrings get sore if you did 100 halfway lifts?
That's a good question. It might be different for everyone, but even if they did, that wouldn't be strength.
No,
that would be endurance.
Yeah. So when we say strength, we're saying this is towards the end of the continuum where it's really hard to do relatively few repetitions. So if you can do more than 5 or 10, you know, if you're, for one thing, we don't do that anyway. we don't go, all right, 10 reps of halfway lift.
No,
10,
you're so right, Travis.
Maybe you would lift up and lower from Shalabhasana a few times.
Maybe a few
but
times
again,
a day. Sometimes, yeah.
It's not like, okay, we're doing 3 max 3 max repetitions of Shalabhasana. It's like, oh, well, we're gonna do 3 or 5 or 10, but you could have done
however 20.
We
don't take it we don't repeat it to the point where we get to,
so it's not you're not going to the point of momentary muscular failure or that higher end of fatigue, and the load isn't sufficient that you could only do 5 or fewer reps or 10 or fewer reps. Like that's
Precisely.
where the true strengthening magic happens.
Exactly.
We don't see that with most of those poses that we've just talked about. But there is one other one, right?
I wonder if you're thinking what I'm thinking. What do you think about Warrior 3? Virabhadrasana 3.
That wasn't even what I was thinking. So there are 2 other ones. But so what do we see with Warrior 3?
I see with Warrior 3 that, like, in a yoga context, that's a really similar movement pattern to in the gym. That might be called a single leg deadlift, right? Which is basically like, in the gym, it's like Warrior 3, but repeated over and over, and with weight, usually with weight, and to the point where you get to momentary muscular failure. So in yoga, like that movement pattern, it's using the hamstrings because you're hinging forward. It's the standing leg we're talking about mainly that's being targeted, those hamstrings. But you don't have added weight, and you're not repeating it so many times in a row.
Right. So that's just that example again. If you did for a beginner, if you did do 10
Warrior 3
repetitions, up and down, you'd feel it.
Yes,
the next
I totally
day.
agree.
And that would be a strengthening stimulus. But eventually, if you continue to do it with body weight, you would acclimate to that, and it would no longer, because your capacity, your ceiling would just go up
100%.
And anyway,
you would adapt and plateau.
But even given that, we hardly ever do repetitions of that. It's more.
I don't think I've ever been in a yoga class where we've done 10 lower, into Warrior 3 10 times, like in a row. Like that's just not the style of yoga. That's not how we treat our poses generally.
Yeah, you might hold it for a period of time, right?
That's true. Totally.
Again, we're getting more into the endurance side of things.
Precisely. But Travis, you said there was one more pose that you were thinking of. What's that one, Travis?
I was thinking of was Purvottanasana.
Purvottanasana. And just in case any of our listeners don't know what that is, you might also think of that as reverse plank, reverse plank pose. Or if people know reverse table, it's basically like reverse table with straight legs.
So arms are behind you, and then legs are straight. So full hip extension. And I guess you would start in staff pose.
Yeah, totally.
And then arms are behind, and you bridge the hips up.
And you lift the hips up. Exactly. That's Purvottanasana.
So what do you think about that one?
I think a lot of things about that pose. I think that pose does actually extend the hips against resistance with pretty straight knees, like we just mentioned. So that's that formula that you actually want to strengthen the hamstrings. However, in yoga, first of all, in my experience, it's a rare pose. Like I don't see it in very many classes. In Ashtanga, it's in the primary series. You do it one time and then you move on through. So it's not very common. It's not like your Warrior 1 or Chaturanga, which you see in almost every class. So there's that. It's like pretty rare. It's also so hard for almost all yogis. It's like maybe on most yogis' top list of poses that they hate. So they might try to lift up and then they're just like, get me out of here. And they rush through it.
Get me out of here.
So it's like we never, even in a class where it does come up, we're never treating that pose in a way where, there's enough volume, like enough repetitions of it where it actually could accumulate some strength adaptations.
But it's funny because that is the one where it actually is so hard that we could strengthen the hamstrings.
You're so right, Travis.
But it's just, it's rare.
Precisely. But that's a really good way. That's a really good point. So, and I think that might kind of bring us to this idea that like as you mentioned earlier, there are some things we could do within a yoga practice, like some little tweaks that actually could shift things so that we strengthen the hamstrings.
Yeah. So more Purvottanasana potentially.
Yeah.
Although it's tricky, right? Because like you just said, it's so hard that, people hate it, or people can't do it, and then maybe you regress it to reverse table. So bend the
You
knees.
could, but then the knees are so
What?
bent.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm saying that's not like that might be a modification that someone makes, which is great because that's still a lovely pose, right? But that's no longer doing exactly the same thing. Like
Precisely.
how would you modify Parvattanasana to try to keep
To make it more
keep the
accessible.
goal with the hamstrings? Yeah.
100%. I think my favorite way is to, and this is not very practical for most yoga classes, but to use a chair where you have your hands up on it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really elevated, because at that
Mm-hmm.
angle, you're not lifting straight up against gravity, but you're more at this oblique angle, and it's less challenging. And you're able
Yeah.
to actually, you could do multiple reps in a row of Parvattanasana.
So maybe that's probably the most accessible for the most people, but
Mm-hmm.
not in a crowded yoga
Practical.
class because you just don't have a chair. So you could do it with
Precisely.
blocks, which will help a little,
Yeah,
but
blocks
not as
under your
much as the chair.
hands.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. Blocks in our hands would definitely help a bit for sure, but the chair is a great place to start. And that's why, Travis, like in our Strength for Yoga program, we actually we have Parvattanasana in there. We call it reverse plank, I think. Yeah, reverse plank lifts. And we teach it in a strength training context where it's repeated lifts. So usually in yoga, it's like you lift up, you breathe really quickly, and then you get down and you move on. But we have people like lift, I don't know what our rep count is, I don't know, 8 to 10 or something like that. But you
Mm-hmm.
lift up repeatedly until you get to that momentary muscular failure.
Till you learn to love it.
Till you learn to exactly. And that would just be one set or one round of them. But then we would come
Yeah.
back and do it, 2 or 3 times total within the context of one practice. Because that's how you treat strength training. But that's how we've adapted that in our Strength for Yoga program, specifically to target the hamstrings. And do we include those reverse plank lifts in our 5 weeks program? We do, I think.
Maybe.
I have to think about that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we do.
The listeners will have to get it and find out.
Yeah,
It'll be a
I'm like
surprise.
99% sure that we do. We have it in there. So yeah, and it is such a good way to target the hamstrings. That's why we really like it, but we don't think it's that effective the way it's normally,
Yeah.
approached in a yoga context.
So
So yeah,
so
what else?
we can do that. In a traditional yoga context, we can straighten our knees out a little bit in our bridges,
Yeah, as we kind of
or
alluded to earlier.
or do some single leg bridging,
Yes,
but
good one,
that's also super
Travis.
hard.
Yeah. And you rarely see that in yoga, but we certainly could do that. Like you lift one leg up, right? And then you bridge with the other leg, just a single leg.
Mhm.
So that adds
and
more load.
and there's another one which you're a big fan of, which
Which one
is
is that?
the bridge slide.
Oh, yeah. How could I forget? It's like in this moment I blocked them out. The bridge
Mhm.
slides are
So
amazing.
what's that?
So bridge slides are basically, we all know bridge pose from yoga, but instead of having your feet on your yoga mat, you would have your feet on, in a yoga class, it would generally be on a yoga blanket, but you could also just put your feet on a towel that slides across the floor. If you're on carpet, you could put your feet on a couple paper plates and those should slide. But basically, you lift up in a bridge with your feet on something that can slide, and then you slide your feet forward, and then you pull your feet back toward you, and lift your hips back up into bridge. So it's this dynamic sliding out and pulling back in.
Which is a pretty wild exercise from an
Mm-hmm.
anatomical standpoint, because as we talked about, the hamstrings flex the knee and extend the hip. And in this particular exercise,
Mm-hmm.
unlike any, well, yeah,
Yeah, I think
unlike
you're
any
right.
other exercise,
That we've talked about so
yeah,
far.
at least that we've talked about, there are some other variations of this, but you are performing both joint actions simultaneously.
And with the bridge slides, there's a whole slew of like quote levels or regressions and progressions. It's people don't need to dive in and do it exactly the way we described it from the start, because that's actually super hard. And
Yes.
we teach all those regressions in the 5 weeks because this is a pose we include in our 5 weeks to strong and flexible
Mhm.
hamstrings. So we teach it in a really graded manner
Yeah, and
because
I
this
think
is messy.
that's shout out to our program. That's the tricky part with in a yoga context where, okay, well,
Right?
you could do more, like we're saying, well, Purvottanasana is a great hamstring strengthener, so you can do it, but it's going to be hard to keep track of like that progression, right? To
Mm-hmm.
find the right version of this movement in this moment for you, and then try to build on that the next time, and so on. And that's like the foundation of our whole thing is
Is
we're finding,
progressions.
yeah, we're finding the right scaling for you in this moment, whether it's the chair or whatever, and then we're trying the next time to do a little bit more, a little bit harder to work up to that. Whereas in a yoga class, that's just hard to do.
You're so right. Yeah, which is kind of why, and I know we've talked about this multiple times on the podcast, but that's why I finally kind of came around to the realization that for me personally, just I love yoga, but I just realized it wasn't really, it didn't, for me, it didn't fit as the right context to try to squeeze strength training
Right.
into. It
Yeah.
just doesn't
And
really naturally lend itself because of what you just
yeah, so
talked about.
that's like the whole conversation. Okay, well, if you're not going to strength train, okay, how can we make yoga more strengthening so that you can get some of these benefits? But in reality, it's going to be better if you're not
Mm-hmm.
trying to fit the square peg into the round hole. And let's just do this separately so that when you come back to the mat, when you've done your 5 weeks to strong and flexible hamstrings, look how much more easily you're going to be able to get into and hold Purvottanasana.
Exactly, exactly. And I know you just mentioned like after you finish your 5 weeks to strong flexible hamstrings program and then coming back to the mat. But just FYI, I mean, one could do the 5 weeks program and
Oh yeah.
also do their yoga
Oh,
practice
yeah.
simultaneously. It's not like you have
Not
to
to say
stop
that
your
you,
yoga
yeah,
practice.
cold turkey on the yoga,
Yeah, no,
um,
no.
because
Yeah.
our program is only every 3 days,
It's every
so
three
that's
days,
it's
right?
like 2 or 3 days at the most in a given week, and that still leaves plenty of time for
Plenty
your
of time for
other
your actual
physical pursuits.
practice.
Yeah,
Right,
like the yoga
precisely.
practice.
It's every 3 days, and you can start the program whenever you want to. It's not like it's
Oh
on a
yeah,
set schedule, right? You just like decide I'm ready to start, and then you hit start, or you start the program, and then it's every 3 days from whenever you're ready to start it. But yeah, that's the idea. It's just like why don't we make strength a little more efficient and structured and separate from our yoga practice so that our strength practice can actually do a really good job of progressively strengthening our body, and then
all in just 20 to 25 minutes, 2 or 3 days a week.
yeah, because
It's
people are busy.
yeah, we wanted to make it manageable.
Well, Travis, something that we've kind of I think done a good job of covering hamstring strength and how just some general tips and ideas for how one might do that. Some good ways you could do that within a yoga context, but also like you could take on an actual strength training outside. And we've
Hmm.
covered like some good exercises that there are many, many more and many that are included in our program.
Hmm.
But another thing I thought was important to mention is one whole big thing about the hamstrings that we haven't really talked about yet is that for yogis specifically, but also I think for just most people,
Yeah,
having flexible hamstrings is kind of a
it's a
goal or
very
something that.
desirable thing.
Hmm.
And I think even people with flexible hamstrings often still feel like they have tight hamstrings.
Right. And so I think for a lot of yogis specifically, because flexibility is so important to them, they often project this idea about something like strength training maybe not being so good for them because they're under the
Mm.
impression that strength training makes our muscles, quote, tight, or
Hmm.
in that sense, I'm meaning like reducing flexibility, like makes
Hmm.
people inflexible, because that's just like the societal idea or belief.
Right.
But as we know, and as we've talked about quite a few times on the podcast, that belief isn't actually supported by what research has shown about strength
Hmm.
training. And we know
Hmm.
that when we strength train through full ranges of motion, we actually improve flexibility. And
Hmm.
research suggests that strength training through full ranges of motion actually improves flexibility as efficiently as passive stretching does. So that's just a really cool, reassuring point to throw out there for people who maybe were hesitant about strength training because they were afraid it might hinder their yoga practice and take away from their flexibility. They should just
Yeah.
know that that's actually not the case.
Yeah. If you've been doing yoga for a long time and you feel like you're at like hit a plateau with your hamstring flexibility, strength training could be exactly the thing. You might have thought that that was good, it would work against you, but it could be exactly the thing, like the missing ingredient to
Right.
allow you more ease and more range of motion and more comfort in a forward fold. And I think that was
Yeah.
exactly your experience when you started strength training however many years ago, right?
100%. Yeah, I can personally attest to that. And I remember telling you when we were kind of first hanging out and confessing to you that I felt like I was someone who wasn't very flexible in my
Yeah.
hamstrings, you
Yeah,
know?
you didn't like to show off your forward fold.
Right. I definitely could admit I'm quite flexible in many joints in my body for sure. Like and a lot of that is just like what you're born with and blah blah blah. But my hamstrings specifically, I felt, and of course my it's always relative, right? And so my perception is kind of skewed because I'm a yogi, so I'm comparing
Right,
myself
right,
to
right, right.
like
Compared to
super bendy.
average Joe, like
Yeah,
sure you have a deep
I
forward
have
fold, but
right.
when you look at other, maybe it was other Ashtangis who
Mhm,
you
yeah.
practice with frequently, and they're what, touching their nose to their knee, or I don't know what,
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
whatever
that's a
the
good yeah.
yeah. And if you're not doing that, then you could,
You
and
feel
you want to do that, and you're a yogi on the internet, like you
mhm.
might not want to show off that pose as much as something else where you have more natural flexibility. And
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So I definitely just felt kind of compared to the other ways that I could move in my yoga practice, I felt like my hamstring flexibility was limiting me. Uh, but but pretty recently, I've just like checked in on my forward fold and all these like things that require hamstring flexibility, and it's like super surprised me. But I've really transformed,
you're
and I can like
yeah, when you see pictures of yourself doing the forward fold, you're like, wait, what?
yeah, I
that's
was so
that's my forward
surprised.
fold.
Yeah,
And
like
I
yeah.
had only seen, I only met you after you started strength training, so like
Hmm.
I saw your forward fold. I'm like, what are you talking about? You have a terrific forward fold, but you just hadn't internalized yet that, like, oh, my forward fold has actually improved quite a bit.
I think you're right. Yeah. And now I mean, I can palm the floor in standing forward fold with straight knees. I could never do that before. Just a bunch of other things. And the truth is, I mean, I've very consistently continued to practice yoga, but I don't in my yoga practice tend to just sit around in long static
Right.
stretches. Like I'm not really a yin yoga like that would be an example in my
That
mind of that.
That's the crazy
Um,
thing, because
yeah.
you didn't
So
necessarily even do like a very dedicated forward fold
stretching.
stretching routine to get that. You just like started deadlifting one and a half
Hmm.
times your body weight, maybe not one and a half,
Right.
one and a quarter, which is
Maybe. Yeah.
quite a lot. I think you could do one. I know you can do like five at 1/4. But anyway, like nothing else changed besides the addition of the strength training,
That's
and you
right.
didn't do that much more,
I
dedicated
didn't
forward
add more
folding.
stretching or anything.
Yeah.
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 And I think that was the ingredient or the missing ingredient that like really kind of brought everything together. So that's just
Hmm.
my personal experience, but we
Yeah.
also know from research, this is really research backed.
Yeah.
So that's why, Travis, isn't that why we've called our 5 weeks program 5 weeks to strong and flexible hamstrings?
Right. So
Like, yeah,
it's a strength training practice for the lower body,
right.
and especially for the hamstrings. But we expect that you'll see improvements in your flexibility as a result of doing that strengthening, especially if this is a new introduction to your movement repertoire.
Yeah, precisely. And we have a focus on in the 5 weeks program and in our strength for yoga program in general, like our other offerings. We always incorporate strengthening through a full range of motion. And that's kind of
Right.
the key ingredient that it's not just strengthening necessarily, it's strengthening through that full range.
Mhm.
That tends to be the connection to flexibility. So yeah, that's why we've incorporated that and make that like a key element of our program. But Travis, while we're kind of talking about things like hamstring stretching and hamstring flexibility, that kind of leads us to another topic that we wanted to cover in
Mhm.
today's episode, which was the topic of yoga butt, quote, yoga butt. And in using that term, we're not talking about like the aesthetics of gluteus maximus. We're talking about this condition, or I don't know if the condition is the best word, but this
Yeah.
experience that many yogis tend to talk about having, which is called yoga butt, which is pain that they experience like at the top of their hamstrings.
Mhm.
And it tends to be something that we hear about a lot in the yoga world. And yoga butt is like this casual term that's thrown around for it, but it has an actual technical term, right, Travis? What's that term?
Mhm. Proximal hamstring tendinopathy,
That's right.
PHT, or high
PH.
hamstring tendinopathy.
Right, right. Because as we've covered, the hamstrings attach up at the sitting bone. That's their proximal attachment. And then their distal attachment, distal meaning further from like the center of the body, that's down, crosses the knee, that's on the lower leg. So when we're talking about PHT or yoga butt, it's the proximal attachment all the way up. And people will often call it like a pain quote in the butt, or, you know, it's kind of experienced and felt up there. And it's the tendon because the tendons are what attach muscles to bone.
Right.
And it's like the hamstring tendon attachment that seems to be where this pain tends to be localized. So we definitely, this is a kind of a hot topic in the yoga world. We got lots of questions about this when we threw out to our listeners for if they wanted to submit questions for today's episode. So we were definitely happy to talk about this topic. And honestly, I mean, I don't know that we even really have a ton to share about proximal hamstring tendinopathy. It seems that there isn't, like, it's research is still evolving when it comes to this topic. Like, there's still many questions that remain. A lot is kind of unclear as far as like what actually causes proximal hamstring tendinopathy. But there are some things that we do know. And one thing that we know about PHT is that it's basically characterized by, we might call it like sensitized hamstring tendon, or like a sensitive hamstring, a painful hamstring tendon that's experienced in a position of hip flexion.
Dun, dun, dun.
In
relation to forward folding in yoga.
Exactly. So forward fold is by definition hip flexion. That's where we're flexing the hips. So it makes sense. I mean, if we do a lot of forward folding in yoga, which we do, if yogis or anyone like has proximal hamstring tendinopathy or just that high hamstring pain, it makes sense they would feel it in their yoga forward folds. However, we should point out that although it tends to be on an anecdotal level, commonly discussed in the yoga world, it's not, this experience or this PHT is not only relegated to yogis. In fact, it's a lot more widespread than that, right? Like many athletes, including runners specifically, tend to develop proximal hamstring tendinopathy. And also sedentary people who are not active at all tend to, like, often can develop proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So we don't want to paint it as like this yoga only occurrence, because it's certainly not. I think my belief around it is just we happen to do a lot of forward folds in yoga, so maybe we just notice it more in that context.
If you're not doing a lot of forward folding, then maybe it's just not bugging you.
Right. But just to give a little more broader context for like hip flexion and hip flexion type activities, like I mentioned that runners sometimes develop this. So running is an activity that involves hip flexion. Other activities of hip flexion might be something like squats or squatting in the gym. You can picture as you lower down, you're flexing your hips, and as you lift back up. Lunges are also hip flexion. On a day-to-day level, like walking upstairs, it involves hip flexion. And in all of these activities, people who do have PHT, it's common that they might experience the pain in all of these activities. And then sitting in chair, or just sitting in general, involves hip flexion. And so a lot of people, even sedentary people who might develop this, often feel it after prolonged sitting. And specifically sitting in on surfaces that are hard, like maybe not super soft, they might feel it more. So just to give a little bit of a broader context, I think in the yoga world, we can get a little kind of like focused on what we tend to see, which is those forward folds in yoga. But like, it's not just that, right, where this can come up. And also maybe just to make sure that we point out that proximal hamstring tendinopathy is a diagnosis that one receives from like a healthcare professional, like a physical therapist or a physiotherapist. And we're not here to just suggest that just anybody who happens to experience some hamstring pain at the top of their hamstring, we're not saying you have PHT.
This is not medical advice.
Exactly. It very well might not be. It might be something else. It might be nothing. But PHT is still
consult a medical professional.
Yeah, we want to make sure, that we say that. So I think that's why it's kind of it seems to be a commonly experienced occurrence in a yoga setting. What I think is also interesting is that sometimes this yoga butt conversation brings up some maybe like fear mongering around the topic of stretching in general, or there are also a lot of claims out there that it's stretching. And especially like in yoga, we stretch a lot. We stretch the hamstrings a lot. There's these ideas that stretching causes yoga butt.
Yes. Well, and that's a can of worms.
That's a can of worms. And maybe we won't go too much and
Well, no,
open that can of worms
just
too
because
much.
you said, like you mentioned right from the beginning, all pain, and as well as this pain in particular, is multifactorial. So it's very
Yeah,
difficult to say X activity caused pain. It's like the
totally,
whole,
Travis.
all the things that you're doing and thinking and experiencing are
And your
contributing to
sleep
that painful
quality
experience.
and
Yeah.
your stress levels.
Right. And the things that you're not doing, which I think
Yeah,
is what
yeah,
we're going to talk
is
about
super
next.
relevant here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's not just, oh, I practice yoga, I do a lot of forward folding. The forward folding did me in. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's what caused my thing. It's like, no, it probably wasn't just that one thing.
Exactly. Thank you so much for pointing that out. Yeah, there's always a bigger picture when it comes to things like this. I just think based on what I've learned about this, I feel like it's just we notice it in yoga, because of all the hip flexion.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe stretching maybe could be a contributing factor, but from what I understand, research doesn't even know that. Like that hasn't been demonstrated in research that stretching actually can lead to proximal hamstring tendinopathy anyway. I think it's just like it's like an intuitive conclusion people want to make, based on their yoga practice, but I don't think we
Mm-hmm.
even really have strong evidence or any evidence to show that.
Yeah. So that isn't to say, oh, like if forward folding hurts, then
Right.
then yeah, you need
Consider.
to do something about that.
That's right. That's right.
Because once you have the problem, then you can identify the things that are bothering you, and you
Yeah.
can temporarily modify
Temporarily.
or
Mm-hmm.
avoid those things. But it's not to say that this is the root cause of your problem. You should never do this again.
Mm-hmm.
Forward folding is the devil. Yoga's, dangerous, blah, blah, blah. But at the same
Precisely.
time, okay, forward folding is bothering me in this moment. Let me back off of this for
Yes.
now, or
Yes.
reduce the volume or the intensity, the depth of the pose while I'm acutely experiencing this thing. And then let me do some other things that might help, such as
Travis. I think you put all that so well. That's awesome. Well, we do know that in a physical therapy context, like the general recommendation when people do have PHT and they're working with a physical therapist, the recommendation is exactly as you said, like temporarily back off the activities in which it feels sensitive, and then bring in progressive loading, aka hamstring strengthening, a progressive hamstring strengthening program. And that's because what we really want is strong, or another word like biomechanically is stiff, would be the word for what we want our tendons to be. We want them to be strong, aka biomechanically stiff.
yeah, which is
And
confusing because it sounds like we're
yeah,
saying tight, but
yeah,
stiffness is
it's
not
not tight.
tightness, which we talked about in our episode with Greg Knuckles, right?
We totally talked about that.
Yeah.
Exactly. We can
So we
refer
can
people to that.
refer. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a good long conversation to clarify that.
We'll link that one in the show notes. But anyway,
Yeah. Yeah, but stiffness biomechanically is not about range of motion. It's about this other biomechanical properties of the tendon that basically mean, in a summarized way, that it's stronger. And so when people have stronger, more resilient tendons, and hamstring tendons for sure, it seems that that can actually be, and I'm actually now kind of talking maybe more on like the preventative side as well. So,
sure.
so both if someone experiences this pain, but also maybe someone doesn't, but they don't want to develop it, they should know that having stronger hamstring tendons seems to be suggested that that is a preventative measure to take against developing something
Right.
like PHT.
And the other way of saying that, not to instill fear in people, but having weaker hamstrings may be a risk
Yes.
factor.
Ooh, yeah. That's a perfect way to
So
put it.
so stronger hamstrings are a protective factor.
That's right, Travis. And we just spent a bunch of time talking about how a yoga practice, we love yoga, but it's not a good setting for strengthening the hamstrings for all the reasons that we set out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, if you kind of add 1 + 1 + 1 for longtime yoga practitioners, for whom yoga is like their main form of a movement activity, so assuming they don't also strength train or do something else that offers them strength, if yoga is their only thing, then they probably have weak and underloaded hamstrings and hamstring tendons.
Yeah, which is like probably surprising. right? I
Yeah.
mean, if you're not super familiar with the anatomy of this and the
Yeah.
biomechanics of it, you might think or have been told that by doing yoga very consistently, you will build strength in a well-rounded fashion such that you might not need to do anything else. And
Mm-hmm.
we're saying that's not really the case.
Precisely. That's a really common message out there, that like, and it's just kind of just really this loose idea of like a yoga practice strengthens your whole
Yeah.
body. Like I feel
Right.
like I hear that a lot. But
And it's not, there's no like immediately easy way to know whether you have weak hamstrings. I mean, there
right,
are ways to test, but like I don't I can't think immediately off the top of my head of like here's a test you can do to find out if you have weak
right,
hamstrings.
right. That's
One
a good point.
thing, what actually I can think of one. If you can do single leg hamstring bridges, like
Mm-hmm.
with your leg relatively straight and bridge your hips up and down,
Single leg.
yeah, then and you can do a good number of them. We're still talking a little bit more about endurance, but if you don't have the strength to do any at all, then that could be a
Mm-hmm.
good indication that your hamstrings are weak.
That's a really good point. And just to remind our listeners that that's a hamstring bridge, not a glute bridge
Right.
that we know from you. It's like the
Yeah.
the the
There's
knee
actually
is much more
there's
straight.
and we didn't even talk about this, but there's a way to make it even more hamstring dominant, which is elevating your feet.
Oh yeah,
So
we didn't talk about that. Yeah.
if you go well, just elevating your feet right off the bat in a bridge pose, whether your knees are bent or straight, will make it more hamstring. But
Mm-hmm.
if you go feet elevated plus a position of
Mm-hmm.
relative knee extension, so maybe your knees are bent like 30 degrees off of straight, now you have very ripe conditions for hamstring strengthening. And if you wanted to test, well, how many of those bridges can I do on one leg and on the
Yeah.
other leg?
That's
Then
good. You just
you could
describing
test
that,
your
I can
strength.
feel how hard that is. That's really
Yeah,
hard.
you could test your strength. You can test your symmetry from one side to the other. Maybe you have strong hamstrings on one side and relatively weaker hamstrings on the other side, or
Right.
maybe
It's a lot you
both
could explore.
sides are weak. Yeah.
Right. And so I'm really glad you brought up that feet elevated bridge variation, because it explains why we included that as one of our
Yeah.
exercises in our 5 weeks program. That's like
Right.
why we put it in there, because it's so good for targeting the hamstrings.
Hmm.
We really try to put all these like
Yeah, and
biomechanical
that was
understanding.
another one where knowing that it's really hard, I think we started with two legs and then we had people march feet,
Hmm.
if I'm
Hmm.
remembering
I think
correctly.
you're
And
right.
then
Yeah.
we went into like maybe the third time of visiting that program, we went into the single leg version or
As an
gave people the
option.
option for
Yeah, you
that.
didn't
Yeah.
have to, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. We're kind of showing the spectrum of possibilities. Yeah,
Mm.
and if you're interested in prevent a physical therapy, the occurrence or development of a proximal hamstring tendinopathy or yoga butt, then going out of your way to strengthen your hamstrings is a really good idea. That's
Hmm.
like very
Yeah.
recommended.
And I was just going to say in addition to strengthening, you might be instructed to back off of the stretching of the hamstrings during that time, but that
Hmm.
wouldn't be a forever thing. You would then reintroduce that to your tolerance in a graded fashion until you were returning to do all of the hamstring stretching that you wanted to be doing.
Totally. So I think just understanding that kind of can help give people a better idea of like, yeah, what yoga butt is, what it means, what's the connection with something like strength. And that's, yeah, big one of the many reasons why we really wanted to pull out the hamstrings and focus on them in our program.
Hmm.
But Travis, I think this is a pretty related note, but it's a slightly different topic.
Hmm.
And this was a question that a listener submitted, and I thought this was a really good question to talk about today. Their question was, is it true that keeping the knees bent in forward folds protects the hamstrings, and specifically the hamstring tendons? It's pretty prevalent. I'm not sure that like everyone has heard this warning, but I've definitely heard it from multiple teachers.
Hmm.
Do you have any idea why that warning might be out there? Like why it might be cautioned to bend the knees when stretching the hamstrings to protect the hamstrings?
I don't know.
I think
What do you think?
I think it's because bending the knees like takes some of the stretch out of the hamstrings. This is what I think. This is my
Sure.
impression.
Right.
You're not like stretching the hamstrings quote as hard, I guess, as
Yeah.
if you bend the knees.
But the thing about it is, well, you can just go, you can incline your torso farther forward now.
Exactly.
So
And that's
whether
what
you're
people
getting it,
do.
yeah, whether you're getting it at one end or the other.
Precisely. If you bend your knees in a forward fold, that's going to put some slack in the hamstrings so that you can probably tilt your pelvis forward more because the hamstrings cross two joints. So if your point is to like get people to reduce their stretch, that likely may not be happening because then they'll just probably fold forward more, like you said, from the torso, in whatever variation of a forward fold we're talking about. And then, yeah, on the flip side, if you straighten the knees in a forward fold, that's probably just going to reduce the amount that you can tilt your pelvis forward, because they're like two sides of the same thing. So you may not fold your torso as far. It's like, they pull from different directions or whatever, but it's the same thing. Additionally, we know from that many research studies they will include and incorporate straight-legged hamstrings stretches for like testing flexibility or measuring flexibility.
Oh, absolutely.
Like there's something called the sit and reach where it's basically it's like staff pose in yoga. Actually, it's really more like Paschimottanasana in yoga, which is you start in staff pose or Dandasana, then you fold forward. That's kind of like the sit and reach.
That's like the classic posterior chain flexibility.
That's
like
right.
they make this kind of boxy thing with the slider on it where you slide and push it as far forward as you can.
Totally. That's like the classic sit and reach. Right. And then also in research, there's often the straight leg raise, right, Travis? Which in yoga, that's like Supta Padangusthasana. You're reclined and you lift one straight leg straight up while the other leg stays down.
Right.
So my point in mentioning that is just generally in research contexts, like any protocols need to be approved by
human
IRB or
subjects,
by the ethics committee, right? They have to like make sure that what the researchers are planning to do is ethical and it's not going to harm people.
Yeah.
And so I think
nobody's worried about that.
Right, exactly. So all of that is just to point out, like in other contexts, like research on the body or a fitness context, like you just mentioned, people aren't worried about needing to bend the knees in order to protect the hamstrings in a hamstring stretch. But for some reason in the yoga world, this seems to be a concern. So just kind of want to like assuage for people that they, those concerns. And we probably don't need to worry about that. Another point I wanted to make about this is that I'm not sure that everyone realizes that anytime a muscle contracts, and whether it contracts and shortens or whether it contracts and lengthens, a muscle contraction it's attempting to shorten and pull in towards center. And what that means is it's pulling on the tendons. So muscle contractions are always pulling on the muscle attachments or like where the tendons attach. And that's like what creates our movement. And so basically like all muscle contractions are stretches if we're talking about like the tendons. Yet we never hear about muscle contractions, or if you layer on more load and you're actually talking about strengthening with those muscle contractions, that stuff's not fear-mongered about. And in fact, that's often in a yoga context or in the yoga world, often teachers are like, you should contract your muscles in order to stay safe so that you don't injure your hand. Like there's more of an emphasis on like, that's the preference is to activate your muscles. But I'm not sure we're realizing that in activating the muscles, we're still pulling on and creating stretches on the tendon anyway. So if the worry in yoga in a passive stretch is that we should bend the knees so that we back off the stretch and we're not like pulling on the tendon, if that's the worry, like, why don't we worry about that in an active contraction, because that's happening anyway. The broader point meaning we don't worry about it in active contractions. In fact, they're super encouraged, and so is strengthening. So a passive stretch is just really kind of like a low load version of like what happens to tendons anyway when muscles contract. So maybe if we put it in that context, we can kind of, just realize that maybe it's just not something we need to worry about so much or cue about so much.
Yeah, or it could be one of those things where it's more of an exploration of try it this way, try it that way. If one feels better to you, then do that.
Precisely. Yeah. Like, where do you feel the stretch when you bend the knee? Where do you feel the stretch when you straighten the knee? And get to know your body better and your own movement better. And like you said, maybe be empowered to make your own choice, but you don't necessarily need to be told from a teacher like wagging their finger, like, make sure you do this to protect your this. Seems like one more example in the long line of examples of maybe something that we don't need to say in yoga.
Right. So what should we say instead?
That's always the question.
Yeah.
Maybe instead of addressing that, we can move on to our next listener question that we wanted to address today. Do you know what that one is?
What's up with muscle cramps?
Exactly. So this was a great question that was submitted. And I believe it's because many people have this shared experience of feeling their hamstring muscles cramp, right?
Yeah.
Travis, do you ever feel that?
Absolutely. It's happened to me.
Me
Has
too.
it happened to you? Yeah.
Yes, it's totally happened to me. Yes, hamstring cramps are very common. But and I think a lot of people think of like hamstring strengthening and cramping always happening. But also, cramps can happen in many different muscles too. I think hamstrings kind of stand out for us, but there are a lot of other areas of the body that tend to cramp.
Sure.
So, in general, there are different types of cramps that can be experienced in the body, and like certain cramps, basically what a cramp is it's like an involuntary muscle contraction that's associated or accompanied by like discomfort or pain. That's kind of like the technical definition of a cramp. Cramps can be associated with like certain medical conditions like ALS. Sometimes they're connected to being on a certain type of medication. There are nocturnal cramps people sometimes experience
that
like when they
has happened
sleep.
to me.
Yeah, I know that's kind of common too.
It's wild.
And those are all different. That's like all a different types of cramps with potentially different causes than the cramps that we're going to focus on today.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to explain why you're sleeping and suddenly you wake up and your calf is in a full-on cramp.
Totally.
Like I wasn't
it's usually
doing
the
anything.
Calves.
Yeah.
Right. It's in the nocturnal cramp. It's usually seems like the calves, or sometimes the hamstrings too.
Brutal.
Or the foot. Sometimes people cramp in the sole of their foot.
I used to get foot cramps when I swam. Oftentimes when I was short on sleep.
Oh, interesting.
I don't have any explanation for that besides sleep is really important.
Right.
I don't. It sort of makes sense. I haven't read that that's something that's like something else that plagues people. Like, oh, if you're short on sleep, then you're more likely to cramp. But it sort of makes sense. It's been my N=1 experience.
Right. Yeah, I haven't read it of that as a risk factor, but it kind of makes sense too, maybe. But when we are talking about the type of cramps that most people are thinking about when they're working their hamstrings, that is exercise associated muscle cramps, or EAMC in the research. It's like a specific type of cramp. And those cramps, they tend to be associated with a muscle attempting to work, and that muscle is fatiguing. The muscle's like at the point of fatigue.
Right.
And it can happen during something like a strength training movement. But it can also, as your example with like swimming, it can also be like in an endurance activity.
Yeah.
Like triathletes, marathon runners are kind of really known to like have cramps.
Yeah.
So it's not just during like strength type work. But for me personally, that's my more association is when I'm trying to strengthen my hamstrings or like strengthen other parts of the body. It tends to happen when a muscle is in a shortened position. So that's kind of good to realize.
And the one that comes to mind for me is the bridge slide that we talked about before.
Yes.
Because you're working that muscle in both of its joint actions.
Yes, both of its joint actions.
It's very it's very taxing. It's very challenging.
Yeah, exactly.
So the nervous system recognizes that.
Yeah. It's at fatigue. But it's interesting that it tends to be when a muscle's at a shorter length versus a longer length. I mean, maybe some people have experienced a cramp at a longer length, but they're more common when the muscle is shortened. So bridge slides are a good example. Like as you're pulling the heels back in, then the muscle is shortening. Another good example is sometimes we do this like in a low lunge, or you could do this from, let's say standing might be easier to picture it. You're standing, you do a quad, you know what I'm going to say?
Yeah.
A quad stretch where you pull your heel up toward your sitting bone and you pull it in with your hand, but then you let your hand go and you hold the heel up as high as you can.
Cramp city.
Everybody gets cramps there. Yeah.
Yeah. Because of the length tension relationship. right? The muscle is in such a shortened position already, and now you're trying to hold it there, create that contraction in a really disadvantageous position from a length tension standpoint. The muscle just freaks.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And as we talked about, the hamstrings cross both of those joints, the knee and the hip.
Mm-hmm.
And because they do both hip extension and knee flexion, when you go into that quad stretch and then you hold it, it's like doing both.
You're in extension, so it's stretched at the hip. Now it's stretched at the knee, and now you're asking it to work in that position, and it's like no,
too much. Yeah. And also, it tends to be biarticular muscles where it's a little more common. So the hamstrings are a good example. But I have an example in my own body that I've experienced with my students as well. And this joint is not a biarticular joint, but the lats. So the lats on the back, big muscles of the back, and they cross the back of the shoulder joint, and then they insert on the upper arm bone.
What's the context where you've seen, like, which pose?
So it would not be something like a pull up. So if you picture like arms straight and then you pull down there, you could see the lats are lengthened. Yeah. That's like, so it wouldn't be there.
Be like Purvottanasana.
Yeah, it would be, it would totally be Yes. My example I was going to say, but yours is totally, it's like the same. But maybe you've done this in my classes before, where I call it like the posterior block hold, where you take a block behind you in between your hands.
Oh, right.
Squeeze it. You don't hold it with your fingers, but you squeeze your hands.
That's probably even harder, or like more likely to cramp. Yeah, than Purvottanasana. Yeah. Because at least your legs are really supposed to be doing what's doing the work. But when in the block behind the body, not that there's even any load, but just like
it's just the position.
The block. Yeah. Oh, brutal.
Yeah. And also, you're so right, because that's really more about the arms, whereas Purvottanasana is more the lower body. Mm-hmm. But in my example, you're also, because you're hugging into the block, you're doing adduction. And the lats do that. They do adduction and they do extension, right? Mm-hmm. So lots of people experience a cramp there. The lats are super shortened and they're doing their actions in that shortened position. Mm-hmm. So that's another example. So, and I'm sure listeners have their own examples of even other areas. Oh, hip flexors tend to cramp a lot in a shortened position.
Yeah.
Like our Dandasana leg lifts. Mm-hmm. So the hip flexors are short and then we lift a leg and they tend to. So that's another
happened to me the other day.
Yeah. So the deal is, cramps are very common. Some people are more predisposed to experience them than others. Genetics may play a role. Like some people just might get cramps more easily than others.
They're just crampers.
Yeah, some people are crampers. Exactly. So there's that. They're uncomfortable, but they're benign. So they're not harmful. Not these types of cramps that we're talking about, exercise-associated muscle cramps. The best, I guess you could say, quote, treatment for them, or the research, what research suggests is the best thing to do when you have a cramp is to do a passive stretch of the muscle. Which is just
exactly the opposite of what you want to do in that moment.
Right. Well, I think because it's so shortened and cramping up, I kind of want to stretch it, I feel like.
It's both. Like you want to do that, but it's very uncomfortable to do it.
Right. You're like, oh. But on a very geeky level, here's the deal. It's much is not known about these types of cramps. Like there's a lot that research doesn't know, kind of like with so many things. There used to be this theory that people cramped more when they were dehydrated.
Yeah.
And therefore had this like electrolyte imbalance between sodium and potassium. So there were these old
too, but
folk.
Now
you've heard that too.
Seem to be the case. Yeah.
Right. So now it seems that's the traditional idea, but research has shown
and they told you, okay, you have to make sure you're hydrated. You could drink pickle juice. That was
that's another one.
The what's the word? Antidote.
Yes, and or eating bananas. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Oh, sure.
Because they have potassium.
Right.
Yeah. So these are like the folk ideas or whatever, but they're not supported. It doesn't seem that research supports those ideas today. What it seems today, and again, it just seems like the best working theory, is that it's like at this neuromuscular level with reflexes, and that basically it's when what a cramp is when the muscle spindle, which is this like proprioceptor in your muscle, when that muscle is involved in a reflex that gets the muscle to contract, basically, the muscle spindle will cue a muscle to contract. And then we have the Golgi tendon organ, which is another proprioceptor located more at the tendon, and that proprioceptor will trigger a muscle to relax. So the two kind of do opposite things. And when a cramp happens, it seems that there's this like reflex, maybe imbalance could be a word for it, where the muscle spindle is excited and like upregulated and the Golgi tendon organ is downregulated. So we just get more of this signal to have the muscle contract, and we don't get that like complementary signal to have it relax. So that's my understanding of like what the current working theory is. It's like, it has to do with reflexes. It's this neuromuscular thing.
Yeah. The cool thing though is that maybe the first time you do, especially like we were talking about that deep knee flexion in hip extension and then hold where you're working the hamstrings in their shortened position,
Yeah.
that as you practice that more,
Oh,
it
yeah.
becomes less and less cramp
That's a
inducing
really,
over
thank you for
over
mentioning
time.
that. Because the thing that it seems that research suggests is that one way to prevent cramps is to strengthen your muscles.
Mm-hmm. In those
Because,
positions,
well, I
or
read
not
about like a
even.
study that was done on endurance, like on runners,
Mm-hmm.
and that the runners who strength trained had less cramps than those who didn't. So that in that, the impression was just like their legs, it was strength training the lower body, that their legs
Yeah.
were just generally stronger. Because if a cramp is connected to a muscle fatiguing, it makes sense to me that the further, the stronger the
Oh
muscle is,
yeah.
the less it is to fatigue and even get to that place in the first place.
Yeah. I buy that.
But for sure, my experience is that strength doing like that shortened hamstring strengthen in that quad stretch position. If you do that over time and you do it in that position, you'll get better at it.
Yeah. But then if you
Because
also take a break from it and go back to it, like I find those effects don't stick with you unless you keep doing it over,
right,
if you
right.
practice it and it gets better and then you take a break and then you go back to it, that just happens all over again.
Totally right. Yeah, but so that's just another potential benefit to strengthening. And like in my personal, just anecdotal experience, I used to get many more hamstring cramps than I do. Like in the bridge slides, I
Oh
would
wow.
totally
Yeah.
feel those cramps. Now it's much less common because I'm stronger.
Yeah.
And so that could be yet another side benefit of doing something like our 5 weeks to strong flexible hamstrings program, is maybe it's preventative for
If you're a
cramps.
cramper.
Yeah. Now, Travis, we have kind of come to the end of our conversation. Do you want to really quickly try to rapid fire just like a couple other questions we got from listeners?
Okay.
um, we'll be really fast with this because
Sure.
two of them, I think we can refer people to our last podcast episode with Todd Hargrove about posture, because we
Oh,
talked
super.
about, yeah. So these two are, I'm just going to say both of them because they're, to me, they seem related. Do the hamstrings shorten from sitting? And do tight hamstrings cause anterior pelvic tilt? I know those are slightly different questions, but in my mind, they're kind of
Mm-hmm.
overlapping.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about those?
Well, the first thing I think about the hamstrings shortening is that for the hamstrings to actually shorten, the attachment points would have to get closer. So
Totally,
just the
Travis.
from a very literal interpretation of that, that doesn't occur, right? Where they insert on the ischial tuberosity and then or originate and then insert on the tibia. Is that right?
Yeah, tibia and the
It,
fibula, I think, for the lateral, but yeah.
right. It those points aren't getting closer together.
They're
So
not, because they're on your bones and they
right.
don't
So
move. Yeah.
so if the question is really do they lose range of motion from sitting? I think it depends what else you're doing, right? It's not that because you're sitting, you are there. It's like that things just lose flexibility. But if you're not
Mm-mm.
using the range of motion that you have, then like outside of the sitting, then maybe.
Right.
But
Like if you
it's
never
not because of the
straighten your
sitting. Yeah.
knees, if you
But
never,
yeah, it's because use it or lose it. If you don't use the range of motion that you have,
that's right.
then yeah, it's not because of sitting. Like
It's not because of sitting.
you could sit for 8 hours, and then as long as you go and do something where you're moving through your range of motion, then you'll retain that range of motion.
Yeah, like basically as long as you stand up after sitting and like walk around, then you're gonna re-lengthen them back out.
But it's not the
Right.
sitting.
It's not right, exactly. It's like this bigger picture.
Mhm.
And kind of on a related note, when it comes down to quote tight hamstrings, again, tight is that nebulous term. Do they create anterior pelvic tilt? which, is this fear-mongered, quote, bad posture. But as we talked about in the last podcast episode, there's a much bigger picture there. Do tight hamstrings create posture to begin with, or is posture created somewhere else in our body?
Yeah, it's not that simple.
Right. Like there's a greater system.
Yeah. And then that is anterior pelvic tilt, something that we even need to be worried about.
Yeah, there's that huge question too.
Listen back to episode 25.
Yeah, listen to our lot. Exactly. Kind of addresses those. And then briefly, lastly, multiple questions about hamstrings and sciatica.
Mm-hmm.
Which they were kind of vague, it wasn't like a specific question, but I do think there's maybe an idea that like hamstrings and sciatica are somehow connected, or stretching the hamstrings.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the sciatic nerve runs from a little bit higher up than the hamstrings insert, but like in the lumbar spine, and then goes all the way down
through the back of the thigh.
Yeah, through the back of the thigh. And so sometimes it's usually felt more in the gluteal area, but it can certainly have symptoms that radiate all the way down the leg, including through the back of the leg. So oftentimes the intervention for that is some sort of, it might look like hamstring stretching, and it might be hamstring stretching, in fact, but it's maybe more directed at that nerve, like doing some sort of nerve glide, which if you extend the knee, that will perform that glide on that nerve. So yeah, you're stretching the hamstring as a result of that, but that's not like the main thing that you're after. Isn't necessarily a hamstring stretch. It's just a byproduct of the fact that we're trying to get that nerve to glide,
to mobilize that nerve.
Mm-hmm.
That totally makes sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when you stretch the hamstrings, you're stretching the sciatic nerve. And I don't know if you've heard this, but sometimes there are these cautions in a hamstring stretch. And I'm thinking like of a seated forward fold, like Paschimottanasana, where there are the cautions that if you're folding forward with the foot flexed, that we shouldn't do that. Like this is just like a cue to everybody. Like don't flex your feet in Paschimottanasana because it can cause sciatica. And I don't know if you've heard that before, but I've definitely heard
refer back to halfway through the podcast when we said things aren't caused by anything, but
exactly. Thank you for saying that.
Any one thing.
But possibly if someone had sciatica, then maybe in that position, they're stretching the sciatic nerve more. Maybe they feel that on tension, and maybe they don't want to do that.
Totally.
So maybe someone with that condition, they might not want to flex their
foot. If that bothers you, then back off. That could also be something that you're actually working towards from a graded standpoint.
Totally.
Which you should do under the supervision of a medical professional if you're 100%. In pain. But yeah, you can play with that.
So, Travis, do you feel like we pretty thoroughly covered the topic of the hamstrings?
I think
in
so.
This conversation?
I think so.
I think we covered a lot. And just like one more reminder that if this episode helped kind of support this message that strengthening the hamstrings is a good idea for really anybody with a body, but especially for yogis, because we tend not to do that in yoga. If anyone feels encouraged to like go out there and do that, they should consider our brand new program, which is like designed completely to support that.
For all of the reasons that we just discussed, we designed this program to address these things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
very, very intentionally and deliberately, and in the well thought out way that I'm sure our listeners can know that we treat any project.
All of our offerings. Under the Strength for Yoga umbrella. And it's all about like empowering yogis to feel more confident and strong and better in their bodies. So I'm super excited about having created this with you.
Yeah. And one more, thank you. Same to you. And one more plug for it is just the idea that we already have offerings, our book and our remote group training ongoing program that are more DIY maybe is the word that people would understand, but you're sort of doing it on your own time at your own pace, whereas this is a led practice like many yogis are more accustomed to.
Yeah, we were totally listening to people's requests and wanted to create something that would really fill that need of people who really want that like led practice experience. that yogis are kind of like in a yoga class setting. That's like what we're used to. So yeah, so we hope that this helps fill that need for people. So anyway, yeah, hop on and check it out. And we really think that you are going to love it. And hopefully you learned a lot about the hamstrings in this conversation in general. It's like such a good area of the body to focus on, especially for yogis.
And we talk even more in the program.
You're right, lots of educational tidbits in the program for sure.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Travis, for having this conversation with me.
Thanks, Jenni.